Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting. My name is Richard Burgon, the Member of Parliament for Leeds East, and I'm the Chair of the Brazil Solidarity Initiative. In less than a year's time, Brazilians are due to go to the polls to elect their next president. Opinion polls show that the former president, Lula da Silva, the country's first working class president, who left office a decade ago, with an 83% approval rating, is a clear favourite to win next October's election. Make no mistake, this would be a huge victory for the left. When Lula was set to win the 2018 presidential election, he was jailed on trumped-up charges that prevented him from standing. This was part of an ongoing lawfare that's been used against the left across Latin America. It was used in Brazil against Dilma Rousseff, Lula's Worker Party successor, and Brazil's first woman president, who was also removed from office in 2016 by undemocratic means. And lawfare has been used in Ecuador too, to stop Rafael Correa from returning as president. And it's been used in Bolivia against Evo Morales becoming a senator. The erosion of democracy in Brazil through the 2016 coup against Dilma and through Lula's political persecution were disgracefully ignored by much of the media and directly led to the election of the current right-wing extremist president, Bolsonaro. We in the Brazil Solidarity Initiative are deeply concerned by the foul play that may happen over the next year, whether or not Bolsonaro is a candidate, to try to stop the return of Lula. Let's be clear, if there are free and open elections, Lula will win. That's why we were appalled by President comment suggesting he won't accept the results of the election if he loses next year, and by his repeated threats to Brazil's democratic institutions. Any threats to democracy in Brazil must be treated with utmost seriousness because of Brazil's recent history and because of its 20-year murderous military dictatorship. So we've called tonight's meeting to begin to prepare our movement to be vigilant and to shine a spotlight on Brazil over the next year. We could have the wonderful return of President Lula, a victory for socialists, trade unionists and progressives the world over. But we do have to be ready to highlight any attempts by the Brazilian elites to prevent that democratic choice. And I'm pleased that tonight we've got a fantastic panel of speakers. But before we get on to the speakers, I do want to explain to the audience that translation from Portuguese is available on the Zoom webinar. All you need to do is to select interpretation at the bottom of the screen and choose either Portuguese or English translation. And that brings me on to our first speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Martvs Chagas, who is the Brazilian Workers' Party National Secretary for Combating Racism and the former Minister for Racial Equality. Through his work actively tackling Bolsonaro's racist and reactionary agenda, Martvs is very well placed to tell us about the PT's plans to take on Bolsonaro in the election year ahead and to show how we internationally can best support the fight against Bolsonaro's far-right election machine. A big welcome to Martvs.
Olá, boa tarde. Muito obrigado. Eu agradeço em nome do Richard às pessoas que estão promovendo este evento. Quero cumprimentar aqui, em nome de duas brasileiras, a Nathalia e a Júlia, que está fazendo a tradução, cumprimentar todas as mulheres e todas as pessoas presentes neste evento. Para mim, é uma oportunidade muito grande de poder falar com vocês aqui a respeito um pouco do que vem acontecendo no Brasil. É importante fazermos uma rápida contextualização do cenário em que nos encontramos no Brasil hoje. Após o governo da extrema-direita, a ascensão do governo da extrema-direita através de Jair Bolsonaro, nós tivemos no Brasil a maior série de perdas de direitos da nossa história. Tentativa de privatizações, tentando fazer com que o Estado não fosse um Estado mínimo, mas fosse um Estado incapaz de atender às necessidades da população brasileira, em especial às necessidades da população mais pobre e da população negra, que é a sua grande maioria. É importante dizermos que, na época do governo Lula, nós tínhamos uma taxa de desemprego perto de 5%, o que, para os padrões brasileiros, era considerado pleno emprego. Hoje, nós temos uma taxa de quase 15% de desempregados, com milhões e milhões, mais de 15 milhões de pessoas desempregadas em todo o país. Aumentamos e muito, infelizmente, o número de pessoas em situação de rua. Aumentamos e muito o número de pessoas famintas. Nós, que nos governos do PT havíamos conseguido, através dos programas sociais que implementamos, erradicar a fome no Brasil, estamos hoje com imagens grotescas, com imagens que nos deixam muito tristes, com pessoas correndo atrás dos caminhões de lixos, com pessoas correndo atrás de ofertas de ossos para tirar nacos de carne para a sua alimentação. O Brasil regrediu e muito. Nós regredimos ao século XIX, tanto do ponto de vista das pautas que envolve a luta das mulheres, a luta pelos direitos humanos, a luta pelo direito à sua orientação sexual, a luta contra o racismo. Nós temos um governo que é extremamente machista, misógino, um governo extremamente racista, um governo extremamente homofóbico. E ele conseguiu, num país que tem uma herança escravocrata muito grande. É importante sempre reafirmarmos e lembrarmos que, no Brasil, a cada mês de nossa história, 3 semanas foram sob o jugo da escravidão. Nós fomos o último país do mundo a abolir a escravidão. E isso tem reflexos muito pesados até os dias de hoje. As pessoas herdeiras dos escravocratas, elas são violentas, elas sequer entendem a diferença entre as pessoas e o respeito entre as diferenças. E são essas pessoas, é esse pensamento, esse bloco de pensamento social que dá sustentação ao governo de extrema-direita no Brasil. Um governo que, a todo momento, vem testando os tecidos sociais da democracia brasileira. A todo momento, faz ataques à democracia, faz ataques às instituições, ataca o Congresso Nacional, ataca o Supremo Tribunal Federal, ataca todas aquelas instituições que não coadunam, que não ajoelham diante da sua forma de fazer política. E isso, conforme já foi dito pelo Richard na abertura, isso tem a ver com o que aconteceu nas eleições em 2018, onde não permitiram sequer a candidatura do presidente Lula, criando o maior caso de lawfare da história da humanidade, que deveria ser motivo de repulsa, que deveria ser motivo de estarmos colocando para o mundo inteiro que isso não pode se repetir, porque, na verdade, hoje, o presidente Lula conseguiu provar a sua inocência em mais de 20 processos que foram abertos contra ele. Ou seja, está mais nítido do que nunca que o que aconteceu com ele foi uma prisão política para impedir que o PT, para impedir que a esquerda pudesse assumir o poder. Continuando a fazer, inclusive, um processo de transformação do Brasil. E hoje, o quadro que se coloca, é importante também que nós possamos dizer para vocês, o quadro que se coloca é de uma tentativa de permanência do governo Bolsonaro e, de outro lado, a direita, que perdeu, né, no voto e perdeu popularidade para a extrema-direita. Essa chamada direita tenta reconquistar o governo também, na disputa contra o presidente Lula e na disputa contra a extrema-direita representada por Bolsonaro. Eles se colocam como terceira via. O quadro hoje que se encontra no Brasil, das pré-candidaturas apresentadas, é o seguinte: nós temos Ciro Gomes, que é um candidato do PDT, que é o Partido Democrático Trabalhista, que deveria ser um partido de esquerda no Brasil, mas não é, porque optou por uma pauta conservadora, optou por uma plataforma de direita com ataques sistemáticos ao PT, ataques sistemáticos ao presidente do PT e ataques sistemáticos ao presidente Lula, incorporando no seu discurso valores que a direita propaga no Brasil e no mundo. Então, Ciro Gomes se coloca nessa disputa. Hoje, de acordo com as pesquisas, está em quarto lugar. Depois nós temos João Dória, que é o atual governador de São Paulo, que é um estado, maior estado e mais rico estado do Brasil. Ele será candidato pelo PSDB, que aqui no Brasil, por mais que se chame social-democracia brasileira, mas, na verdade, a tinta, o verniz, é de um agrupamento partidário também de direita. E João Dória é efetivamente um homem de direita. João Dória acabou de ganhar as prévias dentro do PSDB e se coloca também como candidato. E aí, agora, tanto ele quanto o Ciro, e eu vou falar daqui a pouco do Sérgio Moro, eles se colocam como terceira via. Uma terceira via que tenta abrir espaços entre a candidatura à reeleição do presidente Bolsonaro e a candidatura do retorno do presidente Lula. Então, nós temos essas duas. A terceira candidatura que se coloca enquanto terceira via é do ex-juiz Sérgio Moro, que, com esse gesto, de uma maneira muito nítida, coloca o que sempre foi um político vestido de juiz. Foi responsabilidade dele a prisão do presidente Lula, foi responsabilidade dele, através da chamada Operação Lava Jato, a destruição das empresas nacionais, a destruição do emprego no Brasil, a destruição dos direitos dos trabalhadores e das trabalhadoras. E ele, hoje, após ter prendido o presidente Lula e ter aceitado o cargo de ministro da Justiça no governo Bolsonaro, hoje ele se coloca como candidato à presidência da República, chamando para si o nome também de terceira via. É o candidato da mídia corporativa, das famílias brasileiras que controlam a mídia no Brasil, e poderá se transformar no candidato do mercado. Ainda não é isso que nós verificamos. Ele tem uma rejeição enorme, é uma das pessoas com maior rejeição, e terá um longo caminho para tentar se firmar como terceira via, juntamente com João Dória e com Ciro Gomes. Por fim, nós temos mais duas candidaturas. A candidatura do presidente genocida Bolsonaro, que tenta dar continuidade à sua necropolítica, a um governo de morte, da política de morte, que permitiu que mais de 600 mil pessoas no Brasil fossem mortas pela pandemia da Covid-19, e essa pandemia poderia, o grau em que ela se instalou no Brasil, poderia ser evitada ter sido evitado, melhor dizendo, esse grau, se e somente se o governo tivesse tomado para si as ações necessárias para diminuir a contaminação e para dar um tratamento ideal às pessoas. Por fim, se coloca a candidatura do ex-presidente Lula, presidente Lula, uma candidatura que, no nosso entendimento, vem resgatar o Brasil, vem fazer com que a população brasileira volte a acreditar na política que foi desmontada agora em 2018. O que nós percebemos nas ruas, o que nós percebemos nas conversas que realizamos e o que nós percebemos também através das pesquisas, é importante dizer que a última pesquisa eleitoral que foi divulgada no dia de ontem dá ao presidente Lula a condição de sair vitorioso já no primeiro turno. É lógico que nós temos um longo tempo ainda pela frente, até as eleições no Brasil, que ocorrerá em outubro do próximo ano, mas nós entendemos que o quadro que está colocado dificilmente sofrerá grandes alterações. Isso porque, na memória do povo brasileiro, está muito presente o que foi os governos do PT. Está muito presente que, através dos governos do PT, através dos governos do presidente Lula, o Brasil se reinseriu no cenário internacional. O Brasil voltou a ser um grande player internacional. O Brasil se colocava enquanto irmão, tanto na articulação dos BRICS, como na sua presença no G20, como também na nossa presença na América Latina. E nós entendemos que precisamos resgatar esse Brasil que tinha o reconhecimento da comunidade internacional. E para resgatarmos esse Brasil que nós gostamos, esse Brasil que nós temos orgulho, que, para além de ser o país do futebol, que, para além de ser o país do samba, também deverá ser o país da tecnologia, também deverá ser o país da igualdade, também deverá ser o país onde as pessoas não passem fome e onde as pessoas não sejam discriminadas por conta da sua raça e da sua cor. Eu vejo que o meu tempo terminou. Eu agradeço muito o convite feito, agradeço a oportunidade de estar aqui falando com vocês e me coloco à disposição para futuros encontros, com a certeza, com a convicção de que no ano que vem o Brasil se reencontrará com a democracia. O Brasil se reencontrará com o seu destino, que é o destino de ser grande e é o destino de ser um país com igualdade. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade de estar aqui com vocês nesse dia. Um abraço.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martvs, for that inspiring and informative insight into the history, recent history in Brazil and the longer-term history, but also the struggle that you're taking part in now over the next year and how we can help you. We're really grateful for your presence and for your speech. Thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is from the TUC, and that's Stephen Russell, the International Officer with the Trade Union Congress. Now, the TUC has carried out important solidarity work on Brazil, including campaigning against Lula's political persecution and highlighting the threats posed by Bolsonaro's far-right administration. Now, last month, the TUC released a very detailed report laying out the damage Bolsonaro's agenda has done to workers' rights and to social rights, to indigenous lands and to the environment, laying out the rise of hate in Brazil and much more. And so I really highly recommend the TUC's report on the situation in Brazil. I believe it's a great resource for international activists. So it now gives me a great pleasure to hand over to Stephen Russell.
Thank you very much, Richard. one of the problems with a wonderful introduction like that is it kills the introductory few lines of my planned intervention, which was to explain a little bit about the report and what it was for. I mean, for the last few years, Brazil has been one of the TUC's priority countries for international solidarity. And there are, as Richard indicated, a number of reasons for that. I mean, first and foremost is the fundamental principle of solidarity that our friends in the CUT asked for our help. And that was one reason why we so strongly backed the Lula Livre campaign. We had a guest from the Brazilian trade unions came to our Congress a few years ago and read out a letter from Lula written in his jail cell. And that sort of brought greater awareness and unity amongst our affiliated unions into supporting the struggle in Brazil. I mean, secondly, Brazil's issues horribly foreshadow issues that we all face here, but also we face it in Europe and in other countries, and that's the rise of the international far right. And coordinating a struggle against that remains one of the TUC's other international priorities. We need working people to be aware of the threats and unite against them because people are using the struggle of the working classes to trick people, to fool them into believing that the far right has the solutions when we know that unity is the best solution. And of course, the other thing is that at the very heart of it, it's about unions and union strength and our ability to affect change in the world. And we are one of the greatest obstacles to those intent on dismantling democracy and destroying society, as Bolsonaro is. After all, the rise of the new unionism in Brazil in the 1970s and the mass mobilizations that followed were one of the main factors in ending the military dictatorship that ended a few years later. And therefore, the coup that we've heard about that removed Dilma Rousseff and laid the groundwork for Bolsonaro, that may not even have been its intention, but it did that because it removed unions from being a blockage to fighting against the kind of agenda that Bolsonaro represents. The swift introduction of the so-called labor reforms, which attacked the country's strong collective bargaining structures, they may have been aimed primarily at convincing financial markets that the government was serious about tackling debt, even though, of course, the international experience shows that austerity is fundamentally useless in achieving that. But the extra measures that cut off union funding were also about reducing our power to resist. So while Temer may have envisaged the unions defying his kamikaze 20-year austerity plan, which limits public spending increases to inflation and amounts to a damaging freeze on spending on health and education and social assistance, by weakening the unions, Temer has also made Brazil more vulnerable to the ravages of his successor. In our report, a professor of economics at the Federal University of Campinas, Jose Dari Crine, says, in order for the reform to be implemented, there couldn't be strong public institutions counterbalancing them. This logic of businesses having the freedom to decide how work is organized. And therefore, there couldn't be strong unions. In that sense, the reform was very successful from their point of view. It greatly weakened the trade union movement, and then following the reform, its capacity for resistance. And it's that afterthought that's so crucial to us, their capacity for resistance. Our report sets out the ways in which Bolsonaro has seized the neoliberal agenda that helped clear the way for his election by the lawfare against Lula and getting strong financial backing, and used it to further his own far-right cultural agenda. He may have been elected supposedly to reduce Brazil's debt, but he's repeatedly linked the cuts the neoliberals demanded with his own brand of viciousness and paranoia. To cut the education budget by a huge 30%, he laid the groundwork with an attack on teachers and their students, accusing them of internal anarchy and some other bizarre conspiracy theories. Government agencies tasked with promoting human rights, protecting the environment, and representing women, Indigenous, and Black Brazilians have been systematically gutted or dismantled altogether. In the Amazon, Bolsonaro's willingness to make it easier for companies to mine and log it to destruction is matched by his zeal for trashing the rights of the indigenous people who protect the Amazon, attacking their constitutional rights to their land and comparing them to animals in zoos. But while he can disguise some of his extremism behind damaging but mainstream dogma, his attacks on press freedom and on the Supreme Court, his lethal COVID denialism, his misogyny and homophobia, his refighting of the Cold War with his rabid quest against a supposed international communism, and the huge militarization of government shows someone determined to either cling to power or at least leave a legacy of a Brazil forced down a divisive path. And even if Bolsonaro is defeated and fails to engineer a coup to stay in power, there will be a need for a huge struggle to clear out the military presence from his government, overturn the constitutional austerity rules that will otherwise last for more than a decade, and then just start to address the underlying problems that allowed Bolsonaro to do so much damage in the first place. And to do that, I think we need to support the unions and reestablish their place as a fundamental tool in protecting democracy and furthering the interests of the working class. I mean, Brazil's unions have not remained confined to narrowly defined labor issues. They've mobilized across diverse areas, key political struggles. They're building stronger links to other social movements. They've played an important role in resistance to the Bolsonaro government, and they do remain a powerful force. But political attacks and, of course, the problems of mobilizing people onto the streets during a pandemic have left the trade union movement on the back foot. I won't go into the many details of the assaults on the unions, but suffice it to say that from a position where unions were protected and had some of the best labor rights in Latin America, they've been catapulted into the International Trade Union Confederation's list of the worst places in the world to be a working person. There are new laws coming which would further hamper their ability to defend working people. We've got to stop those, but it does start, as has been alluded to, with removing Bolsonaro at the ballot box. But we also have to think about how we strengthen society, how we use solidarity to support our allies and partners so that everything is in place to deliver a Brazil that can recover swiftly from what's happened to it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Stephen, for that presentation. And once again, to encourage everyone to read the TUC's report. I think that Stephen's presentation there was in the best traditions of the internationalism that's so important to our trade union and labour movement. It's given me great pleasure now to move on to our third speaker, who is from the excellent independent media outlet Brasil Wire, that many of you may be familiar with. Nathalia Urban is a journalist from Brasil Wire, who of course have been reporting on the dismantling of Brazilian democracy since the parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff back in 2016. So here we are, Nathalia.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, everybody here tonight. I think my colleagues gave a great perspective of the current situation, but what I want to talk about is we need to start challenging narratives, which is something that us from Brasil Wire have been doing for so long. Because even though we are seeing the polls showing Lula is the favorite, we are seeing also that there has been a change of narratives, not just coming from the Brazilian media, but also from the international media on behalf of the upcoming elections in Brazil. Mainly throwing Sérgio Moro, that disgraced judge that was Bolsonaro a justice minister, and not only he was the responsible for the illegal arrest of Lula in 2018, preventing him from running for elections as a viable candidate for the 2022 elections. And this is extremely dangerous. Moro is not to be trusted. Moro is really, really bad for Brazil. He's just as bad as Bolsonaro, and the media especially the international media loves him because he's the anti-corruption hero, and he's amazing because he's such a nice guy. He's not a nice guy. The Brazil is going through a very difficult time right now because of the actions Moro took in the past. And now we are seeing his image trying to be some sort of rehabilitated as someone that will save Brazil, and also narratives putting Lula's government and Bolsonaro's government as the same types of governments, but in different ends of this political spectrum, which is a total lie. While the Brazil is suffering, while the people are starving and dying out of COVID, or dying because they are being shot by the police, or they are being shot by landowners, or they are being poisoned by the landowners, the agribusiness, Bolsonaro is still planning to do more harm to the Brazilian people, especially the leftists. Recently, The Intercept Brazil launched an article showing that the Brazilian army has been training, combat training, to fight against so made up political movements, and they all made allusion to real political movements, like the landless movement, which is the biggest social movement in the world related to land reformation, against the Workers' Party, against the independent media. So we are going through a very difficult time. I know elections are a hope to us, but until the elections, we have so much time, and so many more people will perish. So many more people will be struggling because of the atrocities Bolsonaro will continue to commit in Brazil. What I can say from my side and from what Brazil Wire and we have been doing is, please consider to support, not just financially, but also to consume the content coming from the independent progressive media, because the British media made a terrible job normalizing the horrors Bolsonaro committed in Brazil, normalizing him as a viable option as a president, and after his election, normalizing him as the only political monster we have nowadays, because he makes Boris Johnson seem normal and fit for office. So we are tired to be to have to endure everything Bolsonaro is doing in Brazil just because Bolsonaro was the chosen one to prevent Lula to come back office and to put Brazil in a path, the path we were in the past, that we could negotiate and look at the European countries, the North American countries as equals, not just as a former colony that has been explored through the centuries. And just to finish, Lula, who is going to Argentina tomorrow to strengthen not just the ties between Latin American progressive leaders, but also to receive an award for human rights at the Plaza de Mayo with the Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, who are the women who fought against the Argentina dictatorship. Before his trip, he went to a trade union meeting, and he said something that I like to bring today to you for us to think about it, not just for the situation in Brazil, but the current political situation, internationally speaking. The only fight we lose is the ones we don't have the courage to fight. So Lula is asking us to fight, not just fight for Brazil, but fight for the working class, socialism, internationalism. So please, thank you so much for coming here tonight, and also please continue to challenge the narratives, but because only challenging the narratives we will be able to defeat not just Bolsonaro, but all the far right that has been rising nowadays in worldly. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the speakers.
Thank you so much, Nathalia, and thank you for all the work you do with Brazil Wire. So anybody on this call or anybody watching who doesn't follow Brazil Wire and who doesn't read it regularly, please do so. Please do so. And now I'm just going to briefly hand over to one of the unsung heroes of this initiative, the Brazil Solidarity Initiative, which is our very own Patrick Foley, who's been doing a fantastic job coordinating the work of the Brazil Solidarity Initiative. So Patrick can explain to us the plans of the group, but also what you can do to further support the work of the group in this crucial year coming up.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. Yeah, really delighted with that. And thank you to everyone who's taken part today. It's great to see over 100, nearly 100 of you joining on the Zoom, but we've also streaming to Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. So we're picking up a lot more views there as well, which is great. There's also, it's great to have speakers from Brazil, Martvs and Nathalia, although she's based in the UK, coming in, and a trade union and MP presence, as well as an analytical presence on the platform as well from Alex to come. So really great platform. Really happy to have put it together. I just wanted to tell you a few things about what we got coming up. Next year is such a huge election year, as we've all heard, and we really want to increase our campaign work and be able to do as much highlighting the issues and as many as events and reports and really getting out the arguments for why this election is so crucial, not just for progressives in Brazil or indigenous or workers or black or women in Brazil, but actually important for all of us in the fight against the global far right. So we have a Brazil Elections 22 statement that we are trying to get as many signatories as possible on, and we'll be hoping to get that published in the new year, just showing that there is support for Lula and for the PT and for everyone fighting back against Bolsonaro in the UK. I'd also like to take this opportunity just to ask if you could become a supporter of the Brazil Solidarity Initiative. Its supporters really help us keep going. They basically fund all our work. It costs money to host Zoom meetings, to do all of this. Our email list, we've now got over 5,000 people on the email list. While that's amazing, it costs money to keep these going. So please do become a supporter. If you're able to, please do donate. I know a lot of you donated when you were registering, so I'd like to thank you specifically. Thanks for that. Really keeps us going. I'd like to thank the translator, Julia Falmanis, for stepping in and doing an absolutely great job. All our volunteers, the two Bens, our speakers, Richard for chairing and Arise for supporting this meeting. As Arise are supporting the meeting, I'd also like to tell you what's coming up from them. This Sunday, they have a discussion on the ideas of Tony Benn, and it's this Sunday, December 12th at noon, and Richard will be there, and a few other Progressive Labour MPs will be there. So if you are interested, the link should be circulating for that in the chat as well. So yeah, thanks again for joining us, and back over to Richard.
Thanks very much, Patrick. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker before we have a chance for a short round of questions. And our final speaker is Alex Main, who's a policy analyst, the US-based Center for Economic and Policy Research. Now, the Center has provided a really detailed analysis and really detailed critiques of the effects of US foreign policy across the region of Latin America, because of course it's impossible to analyze Latin American history, politics and the struggle there without also analyzing the role of the United States, often in attempting to hold back progressive movements in that region. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Alex Main.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that great introduction and for wonderful moderation. And thank you to the Brazil Solidarity Initiative for inviting me. Thanks especially to Patrick for having organized all of this. Please bear with me if sometimes I have a little bit of trouble speaking. I just got out of the dentist and half of my face is numb, but I will do my best here. And I was very pleased to see that in the comments section, there is Oscar, who has said, apart from all that is being said, it is important to highlight the role of imperialism. Because Oscar, that's exactly what I'm here to talk about. So that's perfect. I am here in Washington, D.C., in the belly of the beast. And yes, we've heard some great presentations on, I think, mostly the internal challenges to the left and to democracy in Brazil. But of course, there's a big external challenge. And it's perhaps the biggest of all, which is the United States. And I think you're all aware of the US's very dark past, involvement in all sorts of dictatorships in the region. And that was very much the case in Brazil, where the US, of course, supported a military coup. The CIA supported the military coup in 1964 against really a modestly reformist government. And then afterwards, of course, strongly supported the military regime that killed and tortured people like Dilma Rousseff. But I think less is known, or there's less discussion about the more recent history of how the US government has been supporting very undemocratic developments in Brazil, which we've been talking about, which my co-panelists have talked about. And I think one of the big motivating factors is that the US administration, whether Democratic or Republican, really didn't appreciate Brazil's very independent foreign policy under Lula and Dilma. And of course, Martvs talked about that a bit. So just a few points to make about what the US has done in Brazil. I can't go through the whole list, it would be too long for this short presentation, but I think one of the key things is that early on they provided really crucial diplomatic support to the right-wing parliamentary coup against Dilma that's been talked about through the visit, for instance, of then Secretary of State John Kerry. As the impeachment trial was taking place in the Senate, he flew to Brasilia, held a joint press conference with the foreign minister at the time, José Serra, praised the Temer government. Later on, then Vice President Joe Biden, praised the transition in a public speech that he gave. And said that it had abided by the established procedures to manage the transition in power, and basically saying this was perfectly constitutional, which of course it wasn't. And then afterwards, we saw the results that I think many in the U.S. Administration and the U.S. elites were very happy with, the dismantling of the labor laws that Stephen described earlier. This constitutional reform that went through that, cut public spending on health and education, even though those are enshrined as constitutional rights in Brazil. A package of privatizations of public enterprises, so creating a gold rush for U.S. and international investors. But the most important thing, I think, for the U.S. administration was the fact that Temer, and then of course his successor Bolsonaro, have had a foreign policy that is very, very closely aligned with the U.S. Essentially acting as the U.S.'s agent in the region and in the world. In the region, kind of most evidently with the U.S. sort of aggression towards Venezuela. And another point that I think is crucial is that the U.S. is very deeply involved in the extremely politicized Lava Jato operation that, as you all know, resulted in the conviction and jailing of Lula on completely baseless charges with no real evidence, removing Lula from the presidential race. Lula was and still is the most popular politician in Brazil. Polls suggest that he would have won handily against Bolsonaro. And so, the U.S. Department of Justice made it very public that they were working closely with Lava Jato. There was, you can find quotes to that effect. They said they couldn't imagine a better cooperative relationship in recent history than between the US Department of Justice and Brazilian prosecutors. The main player in Lava Jato, Sergio Moro, is someone who can really be described as a creature of Washington, who spent a great deal of time here, had sort of a State Department fellowship, long before he got involved with Lava Jato. And this was alluded to by Nathalia, the FBI agents that were in Brazil supporting the Lava Jato operation, 15 FBI agents, and they didn't inform, as they should have under the US and Brazilian cooperation, judicial cooperation agreement. They didn't inform the Ministry of Justice that they were even there. They tried to be under the radar, and it was leaked only much later that they were present. And so, clearly collaborating very, very closely with these operators just at the moment that they were working on the investigation and trial against Lula. So fast forwarding, in 2018, of course, we end up with Jair Bolsonaro, far-right, homophobic, racist, anti-indigenous, admirer of Brazil's military dictatorship. He becomes the president, in part thanks to the removal of Lula through Lava Jato. And unsurprisingly, Donald Trump and Bolsonaro love one another. And the Trump administration upgrades relations with the Brazilian government, among other things, declares Brazil a major non-NATO ally, which deepens the strategic relationship between the two militaries and gives the Brazilian military access to privileged intelligence, to weapons they wouldn't get otherwise, and other sorts of support. And so Biden comes in, and he really had every reason to downgrade the relationship. Among other things, Bolsonaro had supported Trump's fraud claims in the 2020 elections. And of course, now, as was discussed, he's suggested that he's preparing a kind of a Trumpian strategy of declaring fraud in the next elections when he loses. So, and he's just, very clearly just, far-right demagogue. And you would think that the Biden administration would want to take its distance a little bit, but no, they've maintained a policy of very close relations with the Bolsonaro government, just as they've maintained most of Trump's very right-wing agenda in Latin America. Right now, well, not in Washington because it's a virtual event, but there's this Summit of the Democracies taking place, and Brazil's Bolsonaro has been invited. And of course, other countries like Bolivia, arguably far more democratic, have not been invited to this event. But I just wanted to end on what I think is still some good news coming out of Washington, which is that you have progressive politicians here, such as Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ileana Omar, many members of the Progressive Caucus, which has gained a lot of political strength and is now nearly 100 strong in Congress, and they're pushing back against the US government's policies towards Brazil. And one thing they've done, there was a recent letter that was signed by over 60 members of the US Congress calling for an immediate downgrade of the relations, though a removal of that major non-NATO ally status. And I think this is an important message for the Brazilian military to hear in the event that some of the top generals and so on might be tempted to support Bolsonaro in fraud claims in the upcoming elections. Then you have the Ways and Means Committee, not a particularly progressive committee actually, but where the Democrats who control the committee have unanimously opposed a free trade agreement with the Bolsonaro government, because of its horrific record, and they have a very strong letter on that. And then finally, and I think this is something that hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves, but you have a number of members of Congress that have been demanding from the Department of Justice more details on their involvement in Lava Jato. There have been a couple of letters. One was sent to the Trump administration, another was sent recently to the Biden administration. They've been signed by senior members of the House of Representatives Judiciary Committee. And it looks like, they want to continue pursuing this very seriously, despite not really getting much of a response from either the Trump or Biden administration on this. So I'll end there. And just to say that, with these upcoming elections, it's important to be vigilant, not only of, what the far right and the right are doing in Brazil and what they could do ahead of these elections, but also what the US administration might do and how they might, once again, try to undermine Lula's candidacy as they've done in the past, and could also, just sort of sit back on their hands as Bolsonaro refuses to cede power. And so we're going to be busy here working with the progressives in Congress and elsewhere to try to push back against that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was really useful. And good to have that critique, detailed critique of imperialism and its role on countries, including Brazil, in Latin America. So once again, to recommend that people look at documentation and articles provided by the Centre for Economic and Policy Research. So we've now got about 10 minutes or so for the panelists to answer questions put forward by attendees of this webinar. I've got quite a few have been sent through to me, so thanks everyone for the questions. And the first question is actually from Pat, and that is, there is obviously a danger of a coup before next year's election during Lula's new term. What can be done to forestall this? So should we go to Nathalia first for her response to that question?
Well, the issue, the major issue about a coup, when the coup is going to happen, is Bolsonaro has tried to foment coups for all the time during his term as president. Since the first year, he has been trying to foment coups, but he doesn't have the correct, the necessary amount of support within the army and within the wealthy class to sustain a coup. That's the major issue right now. What we have to be vigilant when we are talking about a possibility of a new coup is that when Lula returns, and we are like crossing our fingers that he will, is that they use the same methods that they had used once, like using the judiciary system to trying to forge claims against him. We have to be very vigilant with the media, framing Lula as a corrupt, a criminal mind or something. But in terms of a real coup, a military coup, a coup like we saw in Bolivia, I think it's really hard for something like this to happen right now, because Bolsonaro, there is a huge part of the army that is not supporting Bolsonaro anymore. And he doesn't have the necessary allies within the international armies, and not even with the United States, to support a claim that would make a coup something acceptable for the international community. So I hope it's enough about the coup stuff.
Thanks very much, Nathalia. And on that subject, Stephen, can you tell us the role that you think that the TUC and the labour and trade union movement in this country can play in terms of shining a light upon any moves towards a coup, either before or after the election of Lula?
Admittedly, in a crowded market of our government making friends with terrible people in order to pursue trade deals, we have identified the fact that the government has scheduled talks on trade with Brazil as one way of lifting attention. I mean, one shocking thing, which I still can't quite get over, is that years later, the Department for International Trade's great.gov website still cites Bolsonaro as a reason to invest in Brazil. It says his business-friendly climate will be a great opportunity. And it's like, they have seen all the things that we've seen. They might not view them through the same lens, but they've seen them and they've still left that up there. They're not ashamed. And I think we need to make them ashamed. I mean, that's one thing we tried to do with the report by gathering together every possible abuse that Bolsonaro had committed and presenting it to an audience as a unified cause to rally behind. But we need to isolate Brazil, if it wants to go down this path, from any kind of international support. We need to start here at home on that and make it toxic for our governments to express support for Bolsonaro, to pursue a trade deal with the current president, to not speak out against his threats to democracy. Though we're not helped by the fact that we attended a recent meeting of the Brazil all-party parliamentary group, and the UK ambassador said that he didn't take Bolsonaro's threats against democracy seriously. And it's like, well, you might be right, but only if you take them seriously, because you can be the reason why they won't happen. So we need to do more, I think, to raise Brazil up in everybody's minds, so that it becomes completely impossible for the government to give them the kind of support that would allow military waverers, maybe as Nathalia said, to say, well, this could work, we'll do this. Anyway.
Thanks very much, Steve. And I think Alex in his presentation touched upon his opinions on that. So I'll go on to another question, start off with Alex. This question, I think, is a really interesting one. If Lula's elected, it'll be a huge result for the global fight against the far right. How do you think Lula's election will affect other countries across Latin America, Alex?
Oh, well, it'll be enormous. I mean, let's just remember the role that Brazil played in the region when Lula and Dilma were president, and how they really boosted the cause of Latin American integration enormously, particularly with UNASUR, the bloc of countries of South America, which in turn played a big role in the politics of the region, and did the things that the Organization of American States, very much controlled by Washington, might otherwise be involved in terms of resolving both domestic and regional conflicts in the region. And then globally, of course, big role in the BRICS and kind of creating a more multipolar world. And I don't have a doubt that with Lula back in power, they are going to really push this agenda much more than they did in the past, because I think after everything they've been, they understand what the threat is. The threat, coming from powers like the United States, but also coming from the far right, domestically, which is of course linked up with far right movements. People like Steve Bannon from the US have kind of helped with that whole process of creating these links in a sort of a international movement of, far right demagogue movements. And so they're aware of all that. And I think that's only going to increase their, will to really advance a South-South cooperation agenda, a regional integration agenda, and a multipolar agenda, and an far-right agenda, working, I think, closely, as Lula has been doing, actually, especially since he got out of jail, with, leading sort of left leaders in other parts of the world in denouncing kind of, the far right and its sort of maneuvers, in all sorts of parts, in all parts of the world. So, yeah, I think going to see a serious counteroffensive to the far right with Lula back in power.
That's fantastic. If you could touch upon that as well, Nathalia, what the significance across Latin America will be of Lula's re-election. But if you could also touch on a question I've had from Tim, which is, to what extent is the cultural sector, artists, musicians, etc., involved in the campaign to re-elect Lula?
Well, there are plenty of artists there already. Since before Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, there was a huge movement called Ele Não, which was officially led by women, and many women who are famous in Brazil from the arts, from like movies, TV, and music. They were like leading and like explaining why you shouldn't vote for Bolsonaro, how harmful Bolsonaro would be for minorities in Brazil. And those same women are right now with men as well, supporting not just the return of Lula, but also starting the campaign Bolsonaro Never Again, which is like, we don't want someone, Bolsonaro, nor anyone like Bolsonaro ever in power in Brazil ever again. Regarding the importance of Lula in Latin America, well, it's vital. Lula himself has said several times, even to me once, that when we are alone as a country, even Brazil, who is a big country, we are still weak when we have to deal with Europe or the United States. But when we are united, we can fight them, negotiate with them in terms of equality. Like we cannot, they cannot put us out of our game, because we are united. We have a front that wants the same thing, that is the development of the area. We don't want to be explored. We don't want any more of their corporations poisoning our land, or like killing our workers and exploiting our workers, destroying communities. And we're gonna start to doing this together. That's why Lula has been supported by so many leaders when he was arrested. After when he was released from prison, all leaders from Latin America celebrated. Lula has been visited in prison by Alberto Fernandes, by many other Latin American leaders that went there to support him. And I think that they all need him to be back in power. They all need Brazil to be a progressive country again. They all need the Workers' Party in power again, because they know things will improve for them as well, not just domestically, but especially geopolitically, because Lula is someone who knows how to deal with the imperialistic countries. He really, really is someone that likes to take the lead, but also to be mindful with the other countries, the neighboring countries' interests as well. So I think that at the moment, many people from other countries, many politicians from other South American countries, they feel more anxious about Lula's elections than many Brazilian people, because they know that if Brazil is able to defeat the far right, someone like Bolsonaro, someone that makes so much destruction in our country, this will open a precedent, like in Ecuador, when Lula has been acquitted from his charges. It opened a precedent for people to start to review the injustice that Rafael Correa has been facing. So it's really, really about having someone to take the lead, and Lula is a lead man for sure.
Thanks very much, Nathalia. And just a quick final question for all three remaining panelists before we close the meeting. If Bolsonaro starts putting his authoritarian rhetoric into action, how can we ensure that the UK government, and I suppose for Alex, the US government, and others around the globe do not stay silent like they did over the coup in Bolivia, because there were progressives who were good on many other issues who, when the coup happened in Bolivia, either stayed silent or got the wrong end of the stick, should we say, to be charitable. How do we ensure that doesn't happen again if something similar happens in relation to Brazil? Would you like to kick off with that, Alex?
Right, so I can't comment so much on the UK government, although my impression is that they've been in lockstep with the Trump administration on Latin America in general, but I don't know, I may be wrong about that. But certainly in terms of the US, I think there is a lot to fear. I mean, again, as I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, in 1964, the US supported, a violent military coup and then a military dictatorship against a president who was very moderately reformist. It takes very little, really, to get the U.S. Government to be nervous, and particularly with Brazil, because they know Brazil is absolutely pivotal in terms of the geopolitics of the region. And so we must absolutely monitor what the U.S. is doing, try to get a sense of what they might be doing behind the scenes, as difficult as that may be. And I think, the more that can be done from the UK and other countries to highlight, this sort of US double standard when they're having a summit of the democracies and yet have supported a coup in Bolivia recently, and, supported also the parliamentary coup against Dilma not many years ago, and that this could very well happen again. So I think, if others across the world can do everything they can to sort of pressure their governments, their, parliamentarians and so on, to put pressure on the US, I think that's always helpful.
Stephen?
It's an extension of what we were talking about. This government, if it's just left in a void, it'll make up its own mind at the last minute and probably do the wrong thing, because that's the way they go. If they're forced to shun Bolsonaro because of public opinion in the run-up to anything happening, by pressure on trade deals, by being pushed into including Brazil, which it does not do in its annual human rights report. There's one reference to Brazil, and it's something to do with modern slavery, and it's got nothing to do with the appalling actions of Bolsonaro. If it could speak up more at the International Labour Organization, where Brazil has been regularly brought forward as in default on a lot of its commitments on workers' rights, if it can just be pushed into making more of a noise right now, it'll be much harder for it to be quiet if things go the wrong way. But I think the other thing we need to do is we need to be full-throated in our support for Lula. There was a tendency of people of the left as well as the right, when he was in prison, to kind of go, oh yeah, I don't want to get into an argument about corruption. And we knew it was false, but too many people were like, oh, it's too hard to argue against. The charges have gone. He can't be jailed for it. It's been shown to have been a conspiracy. We need to be very loud about the fact that this is a man that we can get behind. This is someone who's going to lead his country with integrity, given the chance, so that people can't use the lingering smear of the lawfare against him to somehow give them an excuse to say, well, everyone's as bad as each other, we'll just let them sort it out and we'll be quiet over here in the corner. So yeah, that's all.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And thanks to everyone that's attended this meeting. Thanks so much to Alex for joining us from Washington. Thanks so much to Stephen for joining us from the TUC, and of course, Nathalia as well. And it feels appropriate to give the final remarks to draw this session to a close before I give one or two shout outs to Nathalia. Are there any final comments you would wish to make about the task that lies ahead as you see it, Nathalia, and what we can do to help?
Well, there are already things we all should be doing, because I live in Scotland, so I have been doing this as well, like write to your MP. Brazil and the United Kingdom have been, they created a joint committee to facilitate the relationship in agribusiness in February. Authorities from both countries, we work together in bilateral consultations on issues related to trade in agricultural goods. This is very problematic because this possibly might affect the struggle for land in Brazil. I'm actually with their mug here today with the landless movement, who have been hunted down by the agribusiness, like animals. The amount of deaths in the countryside in Brazil has risen over 20% since Bolsonaro took power, which is absurd and potentially genocidal. Also, foreign companies continue to profit from the destruction of environment in Brazil. German banks have injected more than $1 billion into mining companies involved in conflicts for land and with indigenous communities in Brazil. The main beneficiary of the money was the English mining company Anglo American. So you do have responsibility for what is going on in Brazil. You can do actually something to support the people in Brazil. Especially in those areas, the land issue area, the environmental area, because those are the ones who are suffering the most right now. So please, if you can, write to your MP. You can find all the information about the United Kingdom involvement with Bolsonaro at Brazil Wire. We have been working on this matter for 2 years or so. And if you have any more questions about it, you can contact us on social media as well. But please don't just wait for things to happen. We really need your help to not just change the narrative, but also to change back our country to a place that was tolerable to live before the nightmare that Bolsonaro is producing right now. So thank you so much, Richard, Patrick, and everybody here.
Well, thank you so much, Nathalia, and thanks again to Alex for joining us. Thanks to Stephen, and to Patrick, and to all the organisers. It's been a fantastic session, very insightful, inspiring, but it's not just about us drawing inspiration from struggles going on in another part of the world. It's about what we can do as internationalists in the British Labour and Trade Union movement to support our sisters and brothers in struggle in Brazil. I think this meeting has shown how we can do that. And it's shown that we need to be vigilant. We need to speak to our own elected representatives and our own government in this country, but also keep an eye on the media in this country to ensure that they speak the truth about what's going on in Brazil. Don't give Bolsonaro an easy ride, and don't join in the pastime we had before, which was demonizing Lula. So please do support and follow the Brazil Solidarity initiative. You'll have seen have been posted into the chat by Brazil Solidarity Initiative volunteers. There'll be further events, further activities, but thank you to everybody for joining us tonight at this crucially important meeting. The internationalism of our movement is so important, and there's nowhere where the effects of our internationalist contribution are more important or will be more far-reaching in relation to Brazil, because a positive democratic outcome in the next presidential election in Brazil, returning Lula as president, will have a very positive effect on many other countries in that region and many other struggles for justice, democracy and equality and against racism around the world. Good night, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us.